As we continue our study in the book of Judges, I want to first kind of thank Justin for his comments. I really did appreciate that tonight. And one of the things I'm thankful for is just to be able to be here. During the middle of the week, sometimes it's great to just come here together as a congregation and worship God and study His Word. Sometimes it's a long week, and so it's great to be able to come together and look at some of the things that can encourage us and help build us up and continue us through the week. And so I just appreciate the opportunity, and I just want to share that. I really did appreciate what Justin said. So as we continue our study, if you recall last week, we finished up the story of Samson, probably one of the better and most well-known judges. And that kind of marked the end of this judges cycle and God's deliverers, which the book of Judges is so well known for. But we have 5 chapters left, so we're kind of coming to the end. But this chapter that we're going to begin in today, chapter 17, it marks a new section of the book. The first section is really chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 10, where there's an introduction that's given, almost like a double introduction in that section. Then through chapter 2, verse 11, through chapter 16, there's this chronicling of the judges cycle that we talked about, and God sending deliverers to defeat the enemies of Israel and sending His grace to do that. And those chapters that we've been in the last several weeks, it's marked by this statement that the people did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And that's mentioned in chapter 3, 4, 6, 10, and 13 in all the judges cycles. And it's a general statement of their behavior, that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. But now we move to this third section of the book. There's no more deliverers. And the last 5 chapters really cover 2 episodes. So we're going to cover one of those episodes tonight, chapters 17 and 18. Next week, chapters 19 through 21. But these episodes give us a more specific view of the spiritual condition of God's people that He rescued them from. So this really kind of gives you a ground level view, right, of what it means to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, what it means to do what is right in your own eyes. And so these stories are interesting, but they really chronicle where Israel's at, right? And so the author, the writer, kind of takes this opportunity to give us some insight into the people. Janine, did you have your hand up? Yeah, well, my understanding is it's really kind of running around the early part of Judges, and so it bounces around, right? So we kind of went through the Judges cycle, and then now we're looking at if we go back to chapter 1, and it talks about Joshua dying, and the people then asking the Lord what they should do, and the Lord gives them instruction to go into the land of Canaan and take over. And all of a sudden we see them kind of falling apart, right, without Joshua's leadership. And so we'll talk about that tonight. But this third section is really what we're going to focus on here the last couple of weeks. And it begins in chapter 17. So let's all turn to Judges chapter 17. We'll look at verse 1 through 6 to start with. And so it says in Judges 17, verse 1, "Now there was a man of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, 'The 1,100 pieces of silver which were taken from you, which you uttered a curse in my hearing, behold, the silver is with me. I took it.' And his mother said, 'Blessed be my son by the Lord.' Then he returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother. And his mother said, 'I wholly dedicate the silver from my hand to the Lord, for my son to make a graven image and a molten image. Now therefore I will return them to you.' So when he returned the silver to his mother took 200 pieces of the silver and gave them to a silversmith, who made them into a graven image and a molten image. And they were in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household idols, and he consecrated one of his sons that he might become his priest. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so the author introduces that saying, right, that we've been talking about, and at first it is mentioned here. But we start with the introduction of this character, Micah, and the fact that there's 1,100 pieces of silver missing. His mother is upset. She actually, gives a curse to whoever took that. And he says, don't worry, I took it. And so we kind of wonder, when we read this, was he really remorseful, or did he really return it because he was afraid of her curse, right? So we're kind of wondering what his motive is. But it's an interesting way the author puts it. He says, I took it, but what does she do? Does she, kind of get on him for doing it, for stealing it? What does she actually do when he admitted that he took it? She asks the Lord for a blessing, right? And so she calls on the name of Jehovah. So it's interesting. I mean, you look at that and it's like, well, I think that's pretty good. But then she says she's going to dedicate the money to make a molten image and a graven image, which is a flagrant violation of the second commandment. If we go back to Exodus 20, verses 4 through 5, that Moses gave through revelation by God. He said, you shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and the fourth generations to those who hate me. So there's this consciousness of God, because she calls on Yahweh to bless him, but then she turns around and wants to dedicate the silver to make graven images. So you're kind of seeing this mixture of, it's not complete abandonment of God, but it's this mixture of the Canaanite gods, or this idea of Canaanite gods and how they work, having something of an image, and then calling on the name of Yahweh. And so we'll see this theme in these two chapters, this sort of idea of melding this together into some kind of a religion, right? Where we honor God, but we do it in a different way. Dana.
Is there anything relevant about that he gives back 1,100 shekels of silver and she sends 200?
Yeah, well, she promised to dedicate it all, right? Mm-hmm. But then I think when it came down to it, it's like, well, I think I'm going to keep 900 and, give 2. So, and I'm going to give it to the silversmith, and he's going to make this molten and graven image. So, maybe there's some disingenuousness there too, right? There's a little bit of selfishness. I mean, it's just interesting how the author puts it, that you have to wonder, why did he include her? Why did he say it that way? But it gives you an idea of how people are thinking. Micah makes an ephod and a shrine for his household idols, and he consecrates one of his sons. And so this is an Ephraimite, so his son isn't a Levite. And so again, it's, this melding of, well, I need a priest, and I've been blessed by Yahweh, but I'm going to have graven images. So there's this just convolution, right, that we're starting to see as this story gets introduced. And just some observations that I made, right off the bat for how this kind of goes. It's like Micah's wanting to shape God into his own liking, right? Because he's really focused on protection and convenience rather than submitting to God. And so if you think about, we talked about how history kind of repeats itself, but that's what he's doing. He's trying to shape God into maybe how things are around him in a society, and how he wants God to be. Controlling God rather than being controlled by God. And we start to see those kind of things play out in this story. It looks like a pretty committed religion. I mean, he's pretty diligent, it looks like, having all of these things made, consecrating his son, having a shrine. But really it's according to personal ideas or beliefs, not really God's will or God's truth. And Jesus spoke about that in Matthew chapter 15, verses 7 through 9, speaking to the scribes and Pharisees. This is what he says to them: "You hypocrites, rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men." So Jesus speaks directly to this. Isaiah before, but even before that, was this kind of behavior. So this melding of things together. And the question is, do we see this today? Do we see people trying to shape God? Do we see people trying to make God convenient? Do we see a melding of things? We obviously see it, don't we? And so it's the character, the nature of man. We see all this kind of play out. It goes back to this period of time and all the way through after Moses, after Joshua. You've got these people that just sort of drift away from God. And so we see this starting to play out. In chapter 17, verse 7, we see another character that's introduced into the story. And so let's read verse 7 through 13. "Now there was a young man from Bethlehem of Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite. And he was staying there. Then the man departed from the city, from Bethlehem in Judah, to stay wherever he might find a place. And as he made his journey, he came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah. Micah said to him, 'Where did you come from?' And he said to him, 'I am a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah. I'm going to stay where I might find a place.' Micah then said to him, 'Dwell with me, and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, a suit of clothes, and your maintenance.' So the Levite went in. The Levite agreed to live with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. So Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, 'I know that the Lord will prosper me, seeing that I have a Levite as a priest.'" It's an interesting way to conclude that. So let's go back and look at this. Levite leaves his hometown in search of another place. And it says he's a young man. And so if you recall, a Levite really couldn't serve in the capacity of a priest until being 30 years old. So I don't know if being a young man means you're younger than 30, but perhaps it does. But anyway, there's this young man wanting to find a better way, a better path. And he comes across Micah, and Micah sees this Levite and says, "Well, wait a minute, maybe I can make him as a priest." So he's willing to subordinate himself. He calls him father, right? "Be a father to me, be a priest to me." And they both kind of make this arrangement that seems pretty good to them, right? In one hand, Micah has this Levite priest, so maybe he feels like, hey, I'm complete. What I'm doing is now right in the eyes of the Lord. And for the Levite priest, he's kind of found what he's looking for, right? Let's just go with the theory that he's not old enough to be a priest, or maybe he just didn't want to be a priest, but then he sees this opportunity. So this is one where it kind of works for both of them. The Levite finds a place to settle and make money as a priest. He's looked up to. He's serving in a capacity. He's honored. And Micah has his own personal Levite priest. But, it's the statement in 13 that makes me wonder. Micah, it said earlier, he consecrated one of his sons as a priest. And then he kind of replaces his son with this Levite. And there must have been some doubt, right, in his mind that this isn't just quite right. If I could get a Levite priest to serve in my household shrine with my idols, then everything will be all right. You start to see kind of the ridiculousness, right, of this melding. But that's kind of what happens when people do what's right in their own eyes. And even today, I think, one of the things that we can probably be guilty of, because we can criticize Micah and we can criticize people in the world, that we say, "Oh, well, that's obvious. You You shouldn't be doing that. It's obvious, it's clear that God doesn't want you to do that. But what other things do we do, right, to shape God the way we want to shape him? And how do we sometimes make God a little more convenient? Or we take bits and pieces, right? And we don't like to consider ourselves in that light as maybe as Micah. But to me, it's a kind of a lesson as we study this to look inward and say, how do I reflect? How do I sort of view God, right? Do I want to be controlled by God, or do I want to kind of shape or control God myself? And I think it's very popular today to take pieces of the Bible and then pieces of society and kind of say, well, the Bible needs to sort of adapt, right, to society and to ideas. And so to resist that is not necessarily very popular. And I don't think it was really popular at this time either, because they're living amongst all the Canaanites, if you recall. That was one of the problems that we saw in chapter 1, right? They had an incomplete conquest. And essentially, they were told to wipe out all the people. They never really wiped them out. They just kind of lived amongst them. And they just melded into the society. And so we're starting to see some specific examples by the author of what it really meant to be doing what was right in their own eyes or doing what was evil in the eyes of the Lord for Israel. So any thoughts, any comments, observations that you see from what we've read? Anything come to mind? Kevin?
Well, I was also just thinking of some of this, the golden calf incident that took place at Mount Sinai.
Yes, yeah.
Development, because you got Moses who goes up, and then it's like, hey, Aaron, Moses is gone. Hey, you've been involved in this whole interaction that's going on. Why don't you make for us a god? And then he gets the calf, and he says, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt. And so it kind of becomes this whole parallel towards everything that's taking place here. The Levite who's coming and helping them to worship this idol.
Yes, yeah, that it seemed right, right? Yeah. And so, as you have some of the absence of those strong spiritual leaders, you start to see people drift, right? And so that's a good point. That goes way back to Moses. Yeah. Randy?
You could have also, Micah,
Yeah.
could have looked at this priest and said, because we're in a situation where the idols are important, but there is some credence given to Jehovah.
Yeah.
And he goes, wow, this must be God's will. And he popped this Levite
Yeah.
right in the lap.
Yeah. Yeah.
It must be what God wanted. So
Yeah.
it's been real easy for him to say, sorry.
Sure. Have you ever done that or heard people say, well, just because something happens, oh, this is God's will, right? Well, I don't know. I'm not sure this is God's will, right, as we read on, because this is an interesting story as it develops. So let's read on, and we actually, as we move to chapter 18, 17 is a fairly short chapter, we introduce another character, or characters, and that is the Danites, people from the tribe of Dan. And so let's read verse 1 through 6 of Judges 18. So in those days, there was no king of Israel. And in those days, the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for themselves to live in. For until that day, an inheritance had not been allotted to them as a possession among the tribes of Israel. So the sons of Dan sent from their family 5 men out of their whole number, valiant men from Zoar and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to search it. And they said to them, go search the land. And they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and they lodged there. And when they were near the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young man, the Levite. And they turned aside there and said to him, who brought you here? And what are you doing in this place? And what do you have here? And he said to them, thus and so Micah has done for me, and he has hired me, and I have become his priest. And they said to him, well, inquire of God, please, that we may know whether our way on which we are going will be prosperous. The priest said to them, go in peace. Your way in which you are going has the Lord's approval. So first question is it starts right away introducing the Danites. And why was the tribe of Dan without an inheritance to live in. Anybody have any idea? I mean, did God just abandon them? Did he not give them an opportunity? Jessica?
They did have an inheritance. They
Okay,
just refused to fight for it.
absolutely.
The Amorites, they weren't allowed into the valley country, so they forced them out, and the Danites didn't
Yeah.
fight to get into the valley, so it's all part of the dedication on earth.
All the way back to chapter 1, right, when we covered that. So Jessica's absolutely right. The chapter 1, verse 34 is it's outlining all the different, ways God would engage the tribes to go and conquer the land, and it would talk about each one. When it's talking about the tribe of Dan, it says that the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come into the valley. So they're confined into this hill country. So after a while, that gets kind of old, and they need to find a place. They don't want to go down and fight the Amorites, right? Because probably too strong. And they don't really trust in the Lord, so now they're going to go wander. And so some of this stuff is taking place going back, into that first chapter or around that time. So all this is developing. They're kind of wandering, trying to find things. And then rather than confess their unbelief in God, their sin to God, and trust in Him, they go try to find a land on their own. So they send spies to search out a place to take a possession, maybe take a playbook out of some of the things that were done earlier, right, with the Israelites under Moses' command. They come to the hill country of Ephraim. They stay with Micah, and they recognize his voice. They recognize the Levite's voice, and so we can only really gather that somehow this Levite was in the territory of Dan, I would imagine. I mean, they would not know his voice unless they were around him. So maybe in his wanderings, he's trying to find a place. He ends up going to the land of this area. And all this is an interesting coincidence, or, who knows, right? God carries out things in his own way. But they recognize his voice, and they ask him all these questions. And he answers them in verse 4. He says, Micah's hired me as a priest. And so they're like, oh, you're a priest. Well, we're on this mission, so can you validate whether or not, our mission is going to be successful? Because we now have a priest. And he gives, I think, probably a pretty glib answer in verse 6. Go in peace. Your way in which you're going has the Lord's approval. Do we really think that that's the Lord speaking to him and telling him that, Jessica?
My translation says, the Lord be with you on your way. It's a bit more ambiguous than that word.
Yeah.
Like, in our Sing Nazarene, that's basically not really an answer. It's just saying,
Yeah.
may he be with you. It's not saying, yes, it's going to be this way. It's just, to me, he didn't really inquire. That's just what anybody would say.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I think that they really didn't talk about where they were going or what they're doing. It doesn't really reveal that at all. But yeah, as I know there are other versions that really kind of make it more of like a vague, right, answer. Like I can kind of walk the line on this and be, non-committal. So I think the Levite just really tells them what they want to hear, right? I think that's really what it comes down to. And you're this priest, everybody looks up to you. You don't really want to give bad news, right? So there were false prophets during the time of Israel, and we see, time and again the true prophets calling them out. But what were they doing? They were trying to, tell people what they wanted to hear, right? Yeah, because that generally goes better than, people will pay you, right? And they'll be a little nicer to you. So.
He's got the foresight to say, I don't want to cross this guy too much, I may need another job.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll kind of read on in the story, verse 7. Oh, go ahead, Dana. Yeah.
This is the first time that I have read about priests saying they hired me. Don't the Levite priests, I mean, I know they pay, but if they become priests, they don't really get hired for a job.
Yeah. But then go ahead, Kevin. Yeah.
Yeah, well, then he's also not doing what he's supposed to be doing, and the fact that he's wandering around looking for a place because they have assignments and inheritance.
Exactly right.
Yeah. And that they're, the people are supposed to lay aside a portion for the priests, and that's what they are to live on, right? And so God establishes this system, but this is more opportunistic, right? I mean, he gets money, he gets a change of clothes, he gets a living allowance. I mean, this is pretty good. I finally found a place. So,
Whatever time you want to give me,
yeah,
give it to me. I'll just do whatever you want me to do, and you'll support me.
sounds pretty good, right? And I'm doing God's will. He probably figures in some way that he is. Yeah. And so, again, this chronicling of what it means to do right in your own eyes. So verse 7, it says, the 5 men, the Danites, the spies, departed, and they came to Laish and saw the people who were living in it securely, after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and secure, for there was no ruler humiliating them for anything in the land, and they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. When they came back to their brothers at Zoar and Eshtaol, their brothers said to them, What do you report? And they said, Arise, let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good. And will you sit still? Do not delay to go, to enter, to possess the land. And when you enter, you will come to a secure people with a spacious land, for God has given it into your hand, a place where there is no lack of anything that is on the earth. So, assured by a pagan Levite priest, they're ready to go move forward into their mission to find a place, and they come across this city, Laish, and they find, what do you think appeals to them? Of course, they say it's really good, but what else appeals to them? What do you think when you read this? There's
Easy to take it over.
easy, right? It's an easy mark. They're quiet, they're secure, they're away from the Sidonians. They're probably under the control of the Sidonians, but they're far away. And this is a good land, and we can wipe them out. We can go in there and take them out. They're going to be unsuspecting. And so, again, trying to kind of pursue this on their own merits, their own strength. And the Danites, it's interesting, who refused to listen to the Lord, to trust in the Lord when they were told to fight the Amorites, right? They kind of refused to trust him. Now they decide that God's blessed them in verse 10, right? When they call that out specifically, for God has given it into your hand. That's what these spies are saying. And so they're declaring that now God has blessed us. And again, it's one of these things where it must be God's will. It's an easy mark. It's a great land. Here's our land. And so it all kind of makes sense in our own eyes, right? But God's just sort of letting it all play out. And as he does in our lives, right, we can kind of concoct and make up our own ideas about how we want to serve God. God doesn't somehow just send a bolt of lightning down or something like that, right, to stop us. He just lets it play out. And we'll see where all of this goes. Any thoughts, questions on that section? Okay. So let's pick up in verse 11. Then from the family of the Danites, from Zoar and Eshtaol, 600 men armed with weapons of war set out. They went up and camped at Kiriath Jearim in Judah. There they called that place Mahanadan to this day. Behold, it is west of Kiriath Jearim. They passed from there to the hill country of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. So here are these 5 spies, and they have with them 600 soldiers. And they want to go pay a visit to Micah. And so in verse 14, these 5 men who went to spy out the country of Laish said to their kinsmen, Do you know that there are in these houses an ephod and household idols and a graven image and a molten image? Now therefore consider what you should do. They turned aside there and came to the house of the young man, the Levite, to the house of Micah. And they asked him of his welfare. The 600 men armed with their weapons of war, who were the sons of Dan, stood by the entrance of the gate. Now the 5 men who went to spy out the land went up and entered there and took the graven image and the ephod and the household idols and the molten image, while the priest stood by the entrance of the gate with the 600 armed men, 600 men armed with weapons of war. When these went into Micah's house and took the graven image, the ephod and the household idols and the molten image, the priest said to him, "What are you doing?" And they said to him, "Be silent, put your hand over your mouth and come with us, and be a father and a priest to us. Is it better for you to be a priest to the house of one man, or a priest to the tribe and a family in Israel?" Then the priest's heart was glad, and he took the ephod, the household idols, and the graven image, and he went among the people. So, I guess Micah had received these spies in, but didn't realize they would come back later with 600 armed men standing at a gate, and they wanted something. And when you go back and look at verse 14, it talks about, do you know that there's within the house of Micah this ephod, the household idols, the graven image, and the molten image? And they make this statement, "Now therefore consider what you should do," or almost like you know what you should do. So it's kind of interesting the way the author puts it, or the way he said it. When you first read this, it's like, well, what should they do? They should probably go in there and just, take those things away and destroy them, right? It's probably what you should do. You know what you should do. But what that is to go steal it with force, right? That's what we're supposed to do. We're going to take it over because he has access to God. He has a way to curry God's favor that we don't. And so we want to take that and his priest, and we want to use it for ourselves because we feel then we'll be more favorable in the eyes of God. So I can only guess that's what that meant when he said, "You know what you should do." Any thoughts at all as you read that? Carrie.
Of course, this is speculation, but when you read chapter 7 of Revelation,
Yes.
about the 144,000, it lists 12,000 and then lists 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes.
Yes. Is not in there. That's right. Yeah. And the absence is conspicuous, right? Yeah. So it's you do wonder, right? And why this is chronicled this way. And as we read on, it kind of leaves that mark on the tribe of Dan as we conclude the story, as we get to the end, right? Great point. Thank you. So let's kind of walk back through this. There's these 5 men saw the idols, right? The ephod, the shrine. When Micah invited them into the house, it said they lodged there earlier in verse 2. And so he's there. They're there seeing it. They're kind of marking, hey, maybe we should come back and we could get something here that would help us. They use force and intimidation. I mean, it's like we got 600 armed men at the gate, and you really want to stop us? So obviously the priest didn't want to. He asked him, "What are they doing?" But I don't think he really wanted to stand up to 600 men. But then we get to verses 19 and 20, and they actually frame it to present this Levite a better offer. I'm going to give you a better deal, right? Isn't it better to come with us and be a priest and a father to an entire tribe than to just one guy or his family? And they probably, gave him a raise. Who knows, right? I mean, he's like, well, I'll make more money here, and I can be even more prominent because there's more families. It's a whole tribe, Lupe.
So is this priest like from the Levite tribe? I mean, tribe? They have to be that same qualification?
Yeah, so he was a Levite, therefore it's like, oh, well, wait a minute, that means that's God's, designation of who can be a priest. But that's layered on, with all of these other kind of really just Canaanite type ideas of how you should worship God with molten images and, just we see efforts to try to put all this together and shape God a certain way that kind of fits and makes everybody comfortable. And where God really just says, look, don't shape me, don't control me. I'm trying to do these things for you. Just follow me. And but God is very patient, but God is also just lets people have their free will. And so we see the free will of these people, being played out through all of this. Larry.
I wonder if when we hear the word priest, if we're kind of in our minds assuming it's almost like we hear it today
Yes.
as a religious figure that has been in some way brought, you see what I'm getting at?
Elevated, looked up to, yeah.
Well, yeah, an official.
Yeah.
If the Levites were the only ones that could be priests, and they were, well then, if they had to stay by the tabernacle all year round,
Yes.
then that means there were no priests anywhere else in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
We know that's not the case. How did the priests, you alluded to how the priests actually got their living. They couldn't own land. And so they were at the mercy. In
Yeah.
that sense, they were hired.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in that, this is the Wild West to me.
Yeah.
This is when things, are pretty spur of the moment, and we're not looking at the lining up all of our rules as we should, and we're spreading it out too far. But basically, I believe a family could hire a priest.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that's what they did here. And so they gave him a choice. You want to be a priest over a whole bunch of people, or this guy?
Yeah.
And you already see that he's not the most honest person in the world.
Sure.
But he's running things here. So he goes, yeah, guess what? It's not the same thing, but it's something like this. You want to be a preacher over this little group, or you want a mega church?
Sure.
I'll go with mega church, because I will be prominent. That's how they put it. You want to be prominent? You want to be seen?
Yeah.
Go with us.
Ambition and opportunism, right? That's what's offered here by the tribe of Dan. And what is the response by the Levite is essentially thievery and betrayal. Right? So it's kind of interesting, right? So in pursuit of opportunism, and the ambition and opportunism is thievery and betrayal. It's kind of how it plays out. So as we continue the story, verse 21, so they turn and depart. They've got all the things they want, and they've got the priest, and they put the little ones and the livestock and the valuables, so I would imagine that's the priest and his images, in front of them, in front of all the soldiers. And so when they had gone some distance from the house of Micah, the men who were in the house near Micah's house assembled, and they overtook the sons of Dan. And they cried to the sons of Dan, who turned around and said to Micah, "What's the matter with you, that you have assembled together?" And he said, "You've taken away my gods, which I made, and the priests, and have gone away. And what do I have besides? So how can you say to me, 'What's the matter with you?'" The sons of Dan said to him, "Do not let your voice be heard among us, or else fierce men will fall upon you, and you will lose your life with the lives of your own household." So the sons of Dan went on their own way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his house. So Micah goes and pursues him, right? He realizes all this is gone. He gets some of his neighbors to help him. And basically, when he confronts him, the soldiers of Dan or the spies or whoever says, basically, "What's your problem? Why are you coming out against us?" And he says in verse 24, "You've taken away my gods, which I've made." So again, it's this kind of mixture of Yahweh and Canaanite. Like you've taken away my gods. And then he talks about, "You've taken away my priest." Verse 25, they threaten Micah and his household with death. And so Micah, all he can really do is retreat, because there's no way he can take on with his neighbors 600 armed men. They're pretty fierce. And they frame it a certain way. They don't really say, "We will do it," but they said, "fierce men." So he kind of knows what's coming, right, if he tries to make a stand. So he goes on his way. But when I look at this character, Micah, I kind of see a pitiful character. I mean, in verse 24, he makes this statement, and what do I have besides? Like, you've taken away my gods, you've taken away my priest, and what do I have besides? So you've taken away everything. I thought I had this perfect situation, right? I had a Levite priest who, now I know God's going to prosper me, right? It said in the last verse of chapter 17. I've got everything just perfect. And then what else do I have besides now? You took it all. It's all gone, right? And so that's the pitiful state he's in. And then he realizes, well, either I die or I just go back home with nothing. But that's the pitiful state. And so he, essentially all that he trusted in was gone, right? And so let's kind of think that through. He said, again, back in verse 13 of chapter 17, I know the Lord will prosper me. And now it's gone. So what about other gods? Let me ask this question for us today. What do we look to for meaning, for purpose, and for blessing in our lives? What do we really look to, right? For meaning, for purpose, and for blessing. So, do we look to God? Do we truly look to God for that? Do we look to our career? Do we look to our wealth? Do we look to our family and sort of, their accomplishments? And do we look to us being, our looks, our physical appearance? And then if you kind of look at those things, we realize they're all temporary and they can be taken away. And the scripture that comes to mind is 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 24 through 25, when the Apostle Peter, he quotes from Isaiah when he says, for all flesh is grass, and all its glory is like the flower of grass. The grass withers, the flower falls off, but the word of the Lord endures forever. And so from where do you seek your blessings, your purpose, and your meaning, right? Where does it really come from? And so we can declare that it comes from God, but how do we really find that in our lives? And I think it's a good question for us, because we can see the pitiful nature of Micah. When he pursued and shaped God a certain way and had everything just perfect, it was kind of like the grass of the field, right? It withered and it died and it's gone. But the word of the Lord endures forever. And when we truly find and seek those things from the Lord, we don't have to worry about 600 armed people taking those things away from us, right? And say, what else do I have? What else do I have? Well, we always have the Lord, right? No matter what situation. And it's an interesting thought, but really everyone is a worshiper, right? It's just, what are you worshiping? What are you really worshiping? Are you worshiping your career, your finances, your family, all of these temporary things? Because if you're not worshiping God, you're worshiping that. And then someday in your life, you're going to say, what else do I have? You're going to be like Micah, right? Somebody's going to take it away. Either in this sense, it could be a thief, or it could be time, because time will take it away from you, whatever you value, one way or another. Only God really truly offers the peace that comes by knowing that His word endures forever. There's nothing that can be taken away. And I'll call on one of Ian's literary devices, irony. Okay? So there's some irony here. So consider this. The object the Danites steal from Micah is made from the very substance he stole from his mother. Right? Interesting. What goes around comes around. Karma, right? Where we could go more biblical and say, you reap what you sow. So that's kind of an interesting twist, that these graven images, right, that is made from the silver he stole from his mother, probably wouldn't give it back to her unless she uttered a curse against him. He'd probably still have it. So So as we conclude, let's look at verse 27 through 31. Then they took what Micah had made and the priest who belonged to him, and they came to Laish. They went back to that city, to a people quiet and secure, and they struck them with the edge of the sword. They burned the city with fire, and there was no one to deliver them, because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. And it was in the valley which is near Beth Rehob, and they rebuilt the city and lived in it, and they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their father, who was born in Israel. However, the name of the city was formerly Laish. The sons of Dan set up for themselves the graven image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses, he and his sons were priests to the tribe of Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up for themselves Micah's graven image, which he has made all the time that the house of God was at Shiloh. So this anonymous priest, right, this Levite, all of a sudden his identity becomes known. And the author says it's Jonathan, the son of Gershom, who is the son of Moses. So it's kind of interesting that Moses' grandson is the character here, right? And so imagine being the grandson of Moses, right? And having at least some knowledge of who Moses is and the influence of Moses and the righteousness and holiness of Moses. And it's kind of funny. I read a quote. It said, God has children. He doesn't have grandchildren, right? We're children of God. We're not grandchildren of God. So in other words, I think what that quote means is you're not going to just automatically be a child of God because your parents or your parents' parents were, right? God has children, not grandchildren or great-grandchildren. Everybody has to make that decision on their own. And we can see all of this really play out. We go back to Judges 2, verses 6 through 10, when it kind of comes down to verse 10 and says, all the generation that were gathered to their fathers. This is after Joshua died and all the elders of Joshua's age died. And it said, there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. And we talked about that in the first lesson, right? Whose fault was that? Was that the fault of the parents? Was that the fault of the children? Sometimes it could be either or both, right? But we can see what happens when that doesn't continue. When the next generation doesn't buy in and fully believe with their own faith in God, they know of him, right? We can see they know about God. They know about needing Levite priests and calling Yahweh and getting blessings and all these kind of things and knowing that I'm going to be prospered, but they don't truly know God and the work that he did for them and the true belief. So,
And here we see the tabernacle is there, like Larry's pointed out, being the Wild West.
yes, yeah,
We have some priests rather ill defined.
yeah,
And yet, we still have this tabernacle that's there at Shiloh, which is a place where the structure is quite a long time. Still, what did it represent? That seemed like it represented something.
yeah. And really, they have this shrine, everything until it says they're occupied, and 2 Kings 15:29 is the Assyrian deportation, so that's probably around 734 BC, and so for quite a while, going to forward, his sons and his family served in this capacity. So again, we can kind of go through this story and in a sense kind of mock them, like, oh gosh, I can't believe they were so stupid to do these things. But it really calls to mind for us, right? How do we, in certain nuanced ways, act like this? And are we doing things that are right in our own eyes? Jessica?
Well, another thing was, in terms of with Jonathan, he was lying when he said he was a Levite. He was connected to the family, but he technically wasn't a Levite. It was supposed to be the sons of Aaron.
Yes, yeah,
It wasn't, and it wasn't that tribe. Even though Moses and his sons were part of that, we have no indication that they were ever consecrated to be serving the priestly function.
yeah,
So he was technically lying when he said that he wasn't.
a Levite, yeah, kind of stretch it a little bit, right? Yeah, a lot. So, God's word is written for a reason, and it's a nice, interesting story, and we can look at it and memorize it. But there's really things in there, I think, for us as we really try to apply it to our lives, and that's really what I want to try to do with the class is pull out of some of the applications, some things we can take from it. So next week we'll cover the second episode here of doing right in your own eyes, chapters 19 through 21. So if you read those, and there'll be some material in the back on Sunday for you to look at as well. So, okay, thank you. Appreciate it.